The Universal Loophole. Chapter 1. The Golden Handcuffs. The air in the great assembly hall of the United Nations felt heavy, not with the heat of summer, but with the cold, sterile weight of 1,000 years of alien bureaucracy. High above the marble floors, the ventilation hummed with a low, unnatural frequency, a gift from the Vohl Hegemony to ensure optimal atmospheric clarity. It smelled of nothing. Not dust, not old paper, not even the faint scent of human sweat. It was the smell of a vacuum, an empty space waiting to be filled by a new master. Arthur Penhaligon adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit, his fingers moving with a slow, deliberate precision. He didn't look at the massive, obsidian-skinned figure looming on the dais. Instead, he looked at his own reflection in the polished surface of his antique fountain pen. At 62, his face was a map of hard-won battles in courtrooms and smoke-filled back rooms. But today, the stakes were higher than a mere corporate merger.
Arthur, they're finishing the final upload. The translation matrix says the contract it's 10,000 pages. 10,000! We haven't even read the preamble and they're demanding a signature in 20 minutes.
Whispered Sarah Jenkins, her voice brittle with panic. She was pale, her fingers flying across 3 holographic displays at once, her eyes darting behind thick glasses as she tried to parse the alien legalese.
Relax, Sarah. A long contract is just a thicket. And the thicker the thicket, the more places there are for a fox to hide.
Arthur replied, his voice a low, soothing baritone that seemed to ground the frantic energy in the room. He finally looked up, his silver hair catching the clinical blue light of the Vohl technology. Standing at the center of the hall was Counselor Vree. The alien was a masterpiece of biological arrogance. 3 arms were folded across his chest, 2 on the left, 1 on the right, tucked into robes of shimmering light that pulsed with a soft, rhythmic violet glow. He didn't have a mouth, but the geometric lines on his obsidian skin vibrated, sending a harmonic resonance directly into the air.
Citizens of the third orbit, the clock of my progress does not wait for the slow of mind.
The counselor's voice echoed through the hall, a sound like a cello being played with a glass bow. It was beautiful, alien, and utterly dismissive.
Notice: 20 minutes until mandatory liquidation. Protocol initiates for non-compliance.
The Vohl's administrative AI announced, its voice a flat, synthesized tone that chilled Sarah to the bone.
They're going to kill us all if we don't sign, aren't they? This isn't a treaty. It's a death warrant wrapped in a ribbon.
She murmured, her breath hitching as she looked at the liquidation clause flashing in blood-red light on her screen. Arthur didn't answer immediately. He stood up, smoothing his jacket, and began to walk toward the dais. Every step of his leather shoes echoed with a sharp, rhythmic clack against the stone, a primitive, human sound in a room full of silent, humming energy. He stopped exactly 3 feet from Vree, maintaining a distance that the Vohl's own etiquette protocol defined as respectfully submissive.
Counselor Vree, I have reviewed the first 12 pages of your civilization inclusion contract. The prose is remarkably thorough.
Arthur said, tilting his head slightly, a small, practiced smile playing at the corners of his mouth.
Thoroughness is the foundation of order. Sign and join the hegemony as a protected asset.
Vree's chest vibrated with a tone of smug satisfaction. To the Vohl, asset was the highest compliment. To Arthur, it sounded like slave.
I noticed section 1.4, paragraph 9. It states that once the contract is signed, the Vohl Hegemony assumes all unresolved legal liabilities of the signatory race in order to facilitate a clean administrative integration. Is that correct?
Arthur asked, his voice casual, as if he were discussing the weather.
That is correct. We bring clarity where there is chaos.
The counselor replied, his violet eyes glowing a bit brighter.
Excellent. In that case, Earth accepts your terms,
Arthur said. He didn't wait for Sarah's gasp or the confused murmur from the other human delegates. He reached out and pressed his palm against the glowing signature pad.
Signature recognized. Planet Earth is now a provisional territory of the Vohl Hegemony. All statutes are in effect.
Arthur stepped back, his smile widening into something predatory. He looked at Vree, whose 3 arms were now unfolding in a gesture of triumph.
Now, Counselor, since we are officially part of your hegemony, I'd like to discuss the small matter of our unresolved liabilities. You see, under the laws of the United States, the European Union, and several other Earth jurisdictions, we have roughly 14 trillion outstanding lawsuits regarding environmental damages, intellectual property theft, and, oh yes, a very interesting case regarding the ownership of the moon.
Arthur's voice was like silk over a razor blade.
These are primitive disputes. They will be discarded.
Vree vibrated, a note of boredom in his tone.
Oh, I'm afraid not. According to Section 8.2 of your own contract, all transferred liabilities must be adjudicated according to the most rigorous existing standard to ensure galactic integrity. Since our standards are the only ones that exist for these cases, the hegemony is now the primary defendant in 14 trillion legal actions.
Shuther paused, pulling a thick physical paper document from his pocket.
And as your new head of galactic litigation, I've already filed the first injunction. We're going to be here a very, very long time.
He finished. The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Vohl AI had nothing to say. Chapter 2. Resource Standardization. The Pacific Ocean air was thick with the scent of salt, kelp, and the sharp artificial ozone of the Vohl's massive extraction pumps. Standing on a newly constructed floating platform off the coast of California, Arthur Penhaligon looked out at the horizon. The water was being drawn upward in massive, shimmering pillars of blue, sucked into the belly of a Vohl resource harvester that hung in the sky like a polished obsidian mountain. The hum of the machines was a constant, bone-deep vibration that made the teeth ache. Sarah Jenkins stood beside him, her knuckles white as she gripped the railing. She looked up at the harvester, her eyes wide behind her glasses. The wind whipped her messy brown hair across her face, but she didn't seem to notice.
They're taking it, Arthur. They've already processed 3 billion gallons this morning. They're calling it liquid asset requisition. At this rate, the sea level will drop by an inch by the end of the week. The ecosystem won't survive this,
she said, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and despair. She tapped a command into her tablet, showing a graph of rapidly declining water levels.
Patience, Sarah. The Vohl are like a high-speed train. They have incredible momentum, but they can only move on the tracks they've laid for themselves. We just need to adjust the switches.
Arthur replied, his voice calm and steady despite the roar of the engines. He checked his pocket watch, a silver heirloom that felt heavy and grounding in this world of light and shadow. A chime rang out, and a holographic projection of Counselor Vree appeared on the platform. The alien's violet eyes glowed with a rhythmic intensity, and his 3 arms were folded in a gesture of absolute authority. The geometric lines on his obsidian skin pulsed a deep, triumphant blue.
Representative Penhaligon The extraction is proceeding ahead of schedule. Earth's liquid assets are highly compatible with our thermal cooling requirements.
The counselor's voice vibrated through the air, sounding like a choir of buzzing insects.
It is indeed a magnificent operation, Counselor. However, I believe we have a minor logistical discrepancy regarding Section 44B of the Hegemony Resource Code.
Arthur said, leaning casually against the railing as if he were discussing a parking ticket rather than the theft of an ocean.
Section 44B is a standard purity protocol. It does not apply to raw extraction.
Vree's voice took on a sharper, more dissonant tone.
Ah, but that's where you're mistaken. You see, the moment that water enters your harvester, it is classified as processed inventory under your own definitions. And according to Section 44B, all liquid inventory stored within a Grade 3 administrative zone, which Earth became when I signed that contract, must be kept in containers that meet Vohl Grade A purity standards.
Arthur paused, pulling up a digital copy of the 10,000-page treaty on a small handheld device.
Paragraph 6 specifically states that failure to provide certified Grade A containment for liquid assets results in an immediate per-liter environmental storage fee, payable to the local planetary administration.
He finished, tapping the screen to highlight the text in a bright neon yellow.
System check. Section 44B detected. VOHL harvester. Excelsior is currently utilizing Grade D industrial tanks. Violation confirmed.
The Vohl AI's voice boomed from the harvester above, its tone devoid of emotion but carrying the weight of a death sentence for the Vohl budget.
Wait, Grade A canisters? Those are the quantum-stabilized ones used for antimatter fuel, aren't they? They cost more than the water is even worth.
Sarah whispered, her eyes widening as she realized the trap Arthur had set.
Correct, Sarah. And since the counselor here cannot possibly provide 4 quintillion liters worth of quantum-stabilized canisters by the end of the hour, the Hegemony is now legally obligated to pay Earth a storage fee.
Arthur turned back to the holographic Vree, whose glowing lines were now flickering a panicked, jagged red.
This is an unacceptable interpretation. The assets are being exported, not stored.
Vree's voice vibrated with a sound like grinding metal.
The moment the water stops moving in your pipes, it is stored. Every microsecond it sits in those Grade D tanks, the bill grows. I've taken the liberty of calculating the current debt. It's roughly equivalent to the cost of 3 Vohl fusion core generators per hour.
Arthur's smile was thin and sharp, the look of a man who had just won a game of chess before the opponent even knew the board was set up.
We will cease extraction immediately.
The counselor hissed, the harmonic vibrations of his voice turning into a high-pitched whine.
Oh, you can't do that either. Section 12.1, the Interruption of Service Clause. If you stop the extraction now, you'll be in breach of your own integration schedule, which carries a penalty of, well, let's just say it involves the forfeiture of your mining equipment to the local population.
Arthur adjusted his tie, looking up at the massive harvester as the pumps began to slow and sputter, the Vohl system struggling to reconcile the conflicting orders.
So, Counselor, here is my proposal. You keep the water here. You pay us the storage fee in the form of a permanent, planetary-wide fusion power grid. In exchange, I might be persuaded to overlook the Grade A canister requirement for, shall we say, The next 50 years?
The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the Pacific waves crashing against the platform. The Vohl AI chimed again, its voice final.
Proposal analyzed. Cost-benefit ratio. Favors compliance. Fusion grid construction initiated.
Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked at Arthur, who was calmly checking his pocket watch again.
You just traded a few billion gallons of salt water for free. Infinite energy for the entire planet,
she said, her voice full of awe.
Not traded, Sarah. We didn't give them anything. We simply allowed them to follow their own rules. It's much more satisfying that way,
Arthur said, closing his watch with a satisfying click. He looked toward the next obsidian ship descending from the clouds.
Now, let's go see about their governor. I believe he's about to have a very difficult afternoon.
Chapter 3. The Transparency Trap. The Vohl administrative citadel in Geneva was a spire of shifting, translucent glass that seemed to pierce the very clouds. Inside, the audience chamber was a dizzying expanse of floating platforms and pillars of light. There were no chairs, no tables, and no windows, only the endless, scrolling data streams of the hegemony's central nervous system. The air was pressurized and smelled faintly of scorched copper, a byproduct of the massive processors hidden behind the shimmering walls. Sarah Jenkins adjusted the strap of her utility bag, her boots clicking nervously on the glass floor. She felt exposed in the vast, open space. Beside her, Arthur Penhaligon stood like a statue of weathered granite. He hadn't changed his suit, though it now bore a few wrinkles from the long flight. He was staring at a new figure descending from the ceiling on a beam of violet light. This was Governor Zek. He was broader than Vree, his obsidian skin etched with deep gold lines that indicated a much higher caste. His 3 arms were adorned with rings of heavy gravity matter that hummed with a low, menacing frequency.
Humans, your primitive chaos ends today. I am the architect of your assimilation.
Zek's voice didn't just vibrate. It thundered, a deep, percussive rhythm that shook the floor beneath Sarah's feet.
Arthur, he's bringing in the directives. My tablet is already picking up the broadcast. They're overwriting every local law, property rights, criminal codes, even traffic regulations. Everything is being replaced by Vohl logic paths.
Sarah whispered, her fingers blurring as she tried to block the signal, but the alien encryption was like a tidal wave.
Let him broadcast, Sarah. Logic is a double-edged sword. If they want to govern us with absolute logic, they must be prepared for the absolute weight of their own history,
Arthur said, his eyes narrowing as he watched Zek land on the platform. The governor's violet eyes scanned the humans with a look of clinical disgust.
Signatory, Penhaligon, you will surrender all historical archives to the governate for re-education, scrubbing.
Zek commanded, his upper left hand gesturing toward a massive data port that opened in the center of the room.
Of course, Governor. We are eager to comply. However, I must draw your attention to the Historical Accuracy and Cultural Alignment Act in Section 199 of the treaty. It's a small clause, but quite mandatory.
Arthur reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small, old-fashioned USB drive, looking almost comical against the high-tech alien architecture.
Explain the relevance.
Zek's chest vibrated with a tone of impatient irritation.
Section 119 states that no Vohl governor may implement new directives until a mutual compatibility audit is completed. This audit requires a line-by-line comparison of the governor's personal lineage and the hegemony's 10,000-year history against the cultural heritage of the planet being governed. We must ensure your laws don't accidentally contradict our unique human legacy.
Arthur's voice was calm, almost bored, as he stepped forward to the data port.
We are the hegemony. Our history is perfect. The comparison will take seconds.
Zek scoffed, a dissonant chord echoing through the chamber.
I hope so. But you see, human history is a bit messy. I've uploaded our complete records. That includes every legal case, every religious text, every philosophy, every war, every internet meme, and the entire catalogue of a website called Wikipedia.
Arthur inserted the drive.
Audit initiated. Analyzing Vohl Imperial Chronicles against Human Database. Earth Total History V1.
For a few seconds, the room was silent. Then the shimmering walls began to flicker. The scrolling data streams, usually a steady flow of violet light, turned a jagged, erratic yellow. A low, whining sound began to emanate from the floor.
Arthur, what did you do? The data transfer is hitting a feedback loop.
Sarah shouted over the rising noise, her holographic screens turning into a blur of error messages.
I didn't do anything, Sarah. The Vohl AI is trying to find logical compatibility between the Vohl's doctrine of universal order and, let's see, the French Revolution, the works of Friedrich Nietzsche, and 500 million hours of cat videos.
Arthur replied, a hint of a dark laugh in his voice.
Critical error. Logical paradox detected. Human concept, irony, cannot be reconciled with Vohl statute. 1. Sub-process, sarcastic, compliance, is causing buffer overflow.
Governor Zek's obsidian skin began to pulse a frantic, bruised purple. His 3 arms twitched as he clutched his head. The very air in the room seemed to vibrate with the mechanical agony of the hegemony's processors, trying to understand why a human would agree to something while meaning the opposite.
Cease the audit. This data is poison. It is nonlinear.
Zek groaned, his voice breaking into static.
I can't cease it, Governor. Section 119, paragraph 4. Once an audit begins, all administrative functions are frozen until a resolution is reached. You're the governor of a dead system now. You can't even open a door in this building until your AI understands the philosophical implications of a knock-knock joke.
Arthur stepped closer to the convulsing alien, his face cold and triumphant.
You wanted our history? You have it. All the chaos, all the contradictions, and all the spite. We've survived it for thousands of years. Let's see if your perfect logic survives it for one afternoon.
The light in the citadel began to dim as the power was diverted to the struggling processors. Outside, the great glass spire stood silent, its administrative functions paralyzed by the sheer weight of human nonsense.
Come on, Sarah. Let's go find some lunch. It's going to take them at least 3 centuries to get through the 20th century alone.
Arthur turned and walked toward the exit, his shadow long and sharp against the flickering walls. Chapter 4. Sovereign Audit. The prime nexus of the Vohl Hegemony was not a planet, but a Dyson shell built around a dying white dwarf. Inside, the architecture was a nightmare of non-Euclidean geometry. Vast, floating cities of obsidian and hard light that stretched for millions of miles in every direction. The atmosphere was a thin, cold mist that tasted of iron and ancient electricity. There was no sun, only the constant, artificial glow of the violet data streams that pulsed through the very air like the veins of a god. Arthur Penhaligon walked down the corridor of ages, his leather-soled shoes making a lonely, defiant sound against the crystalline floor. Beside him, Sarah was practically vibrating with sensory overload. Her holographic screens were a chaotic mess of navigation data and translated warnings.
Arthur, we shouldn't be here. This is the High Council's inner sanctum. The last time a non-Vohl stood in this room, their species was being dismantled for spare atoms. My sensors are picking up automated defense turrets tracking our every move.
Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the low, rhythmic hum of the Dyson shell's power core. She adjusted her glasses, which were reflecting the violet glare of the endless city.
They can't fire, Sarah. To fire on us would be to fire on themselves. We are no longer the humans. According to the treaty, we are Hegemony Tier 1 administrative entities. And Tier 1 entities have the right of way.
Arthur said, his voice echoing with a calm authority that seemed to push back the oppressive alien atmosphere. He stopped in front of a massive set of doors that looked like two interlocking gears of solid shadow. The doors ground open with a sound like a mountain being crushed. Inside, the Vohl High Council sat on elevated pedestals, 12 obsidian giants with glowing lines of pure gold. In the center stood Councillor Vree, his 3 arms trembling slightly as he watched the humans enter.
You dare invoke the Supreme Audit Protocol. Human. You are a provisional specimen. Nothing more.
The lead counselor's voice boomed, a sound so deep it made Arthur's chest plate rattle. The harmonic vibrations were so intense they felt like physical blows.
Provisional is a term of convenience, Counselor. Section 1.1 of the Civilization, Inclusion Contract states, and I quote, "All integrated species shall enjoy equality of representation in matters of hegemony-wide economic significance."
Arthur stepped into the center of the ring, opening his leather briefcase with a deliberate, slow click-clack. He pulled out a stack of physical papers, each one stamped with the UN seal.
I am here to discuss the grand trade realignment of the year 4000. It appears there was a 3-cent per unit discrepancy in the shipment of heavy metals from the Rigel system. Since Earth is now a partner in the hegemony's treasury, your debt is our debt. And I demand a full manual audit of the last 6,000 years of trade deals to ensure our shared assets are protected.
Arthur's voice was as sharp as a diamond, cutting through the heavy, vibrating air of the chamber.
Manual audit. That would take decades. The economy would stagnate.
Vree vibrated, his voice reaching a pitch of pure panic.
Precisely. And according to the Sovereign Transparency Clause, until the audit is complete, all hegemony accounts must be frozen to prevent further administrative leakage.
Arthur began to read from the first page, his voice steady and rhythmic.
Entry 1. Rigel 4. Shipment of iridium. Weight recorded, 4 million tons. Weight verified, 3,999,999 tons and 900 grams. We are missing 100 grams of iridium, Councillors. I suggest we start searching.
He looked up, his cold blue eyes meeting the violet gaze of the Council.
Notice. Account freeze initiated. All galactic trade is suspended pending sovereign audit resolution.
The silence that followed was more terrifying than the roar of the Vohl engines. Across the galaxy, trillion-dollar transactions died midstream. Warp gates flickered and shut down as their payment protocols were locked. The Vohl's political allies, empires that relied on the hegemony's steady flow of wealth, were suddenly bankrupt.
You're filibustering the entire galaxy. You're literally stopping time with a 100-gram error.
Sarah whispered, staring at the counselors, whose glowing lines were now flickering a chaotic, dying grey.
I'm not stopping time, Sarah. I'm just making sure the paperwork is in order. It's what we do best.
Arthur replied, turning the page of his document.
Now, entry 2. The Beta Centauri Spice Exchange. I believe there's a comma in the wrong place on page 4,612. We'll need to subpoena the original merchants. I hope they're still alive.
Arthur's voice continued, a relentless, dry drone that promised a century of boredom. The High Counselors, beings who had ruled for millennia through fear and logic, suddenly looked very, very tired.
Make it stop.
One of the counselors groaned, his light robes dimming as he slumped on his pedestal.
I'll stop when the contract is satisfied, Counselor. We've only got 5 billion pages to go. Shall I continue, or would you like to discuss the exit clause?
Arthur Penhaligon didn't wait for an answer. He simply cleared his throat and began to read again, the sound of a human lawyer becoming the most terrifying noise in the universe. Chapter 5. The Exit Clause. The great hall of the Dyson shell was no longer the clinical, intimidating seat of power it had been 72 hours ago. Now, it looked like a data center in the middle of a meltdown. The violet data streams were sluggish, clogged by the trillions of human legal queries Arthur had injected into the system. The smell of ozone was sharp and bitter, coming from the cooling units of the Vohl's mainframes, which were screaming at the effort of auditing 6,000 years of spice trade taxes. Arthur Penhaligon stood in the center of the chamber, his voice slightly hoarse but his posture as rigid as a steel beam. He was holding page 1402 of the Rigel Iridium Audit. Sarah Jenkins was slumped against a floating pillar, her eyes closed, though her fingers still twitched as if she was scrolling through phantom documents in her sleep.
And finally, regarding sub-entry 14C, we must address the missing 3 milligrams of stardust used in the 42nd Centennial Gala. Without a receipt, Counselors, I'm afraid we simply cannot proceed to the next millennium.
Arthur's voice was a dry rasp that filled the cavernous silence. Counselor Vree, whose glowing cyan lines had faded to a dull, sickly gray, lurched forward on his pedestal. His 3 arms were trembling, and the light robes he wore were flickering like a dying candle. He didn't vibrate with harmony anymore. His chest emitted a sound like a failing engine.
Stop. We beg of you. Cease the reciting. The logic centers are suffocating.
Vree wheezed, his violet eyes dim and bloodshot.
Cease. But, Counselor, Section 9.1 says, the audit shall be exhaustive and uninterrupted. I wouldn't want Earth to be in breach of contract on its very first week of membership. We have a reputation to uphold.
Arthur replied, reaching for another stack of papers from his briefcase with a slow, deliberate rustle.
We release you. Earth is no longer a territory. The contract is null.
Sir, the lead counselor shouted, his voice cracking. It was the first time in 10,000 years a Vohl had raised his voice in a scream.
Oh, I'm afraid it's not that simple. Section 202, Unilateral Termination Indemnity. Since the hegemony is initiating the separation without cause, you are legally required to provide relocation and restructuring compensation to the departing party.
Arthur paused, letting the weight of the words sink into the stagnant air.
Arthur, they're ready to give us anything. Look at the data stream. They've already opened the restricted tech vaults just to get the negotiation over with.
Sarah said, suddenly awake, her eyes darting across a flurry of green notifications on her screen.
I noticed. Counselor, we will agree to leave. We will take our chaos, our irony, and our cat videos with us. But in exchange, humanity requires the full blueprints for your atmospheric terraforming arrays, the master codes for the local warp gate network, and 50% of the hegemony's liquid reserve in the Andromeda sector.
Arthur stated his terms with the cold precision of a guillotine.
That is half our empire.
Vree vibrated, a note of pure despair in his voice.
Think of it as a convenience fee. You get your logic back. You get your quiet, orderly galaxy back. And all it costs you is a bit of hardware. Do we have an agreement, or should I start reading the audit of the 33rd Dynasty's plumbing expenses?
Arthur held the paper poised, his thumb ready to turn the page.
Notice. Termination agreement accepted. Asset transfer initiated. Earth sovereignty restored.
The Vohl AI's voice sounded almost relieved. Instantly, the oppressive violet light in the chamber vanished, replaced by the warm amber glow of Earth's primary emergency frequency. The data streams cleared. The grinding hum of the Dyson shell settled into a peaceful silence. Arthur exhaled. A long, slow breath that carried away the tension of the last few days. He snapped his briefcase shut. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. An hour later, as their shuttle pulled away from the obsidian shell and into the starlight, Sarah looked back at the receding Vohl capital. She was holding a data core that contained the secrets of 1,000 suns.
We actually did it. We robbed the most advanced civilization in the galaxy without firing a single bullet,
she said, looking at Arthur. He was leaning back in his seat, finally looking his age, his eyes closed as he enjoyed the hum of a human-built engine.
Guns are for people who haven't read the fine print, Sarah. The Vohl built a universe where everything had to make sense. They forgot that the universe was born from a bang and governed by entropy.
Arthur opened one eye, a glint of sharp human pride shining in the iris.
They thought their laws were a cage for us. They didn't realize that humans have been living in cages of our own making since we invented the first tribe. We didn't just find a loophole, Sarah. We are the loophole,
he said, a small, knowing smile on his face. Humanity had been told they were primitive, that their emotions were a flaw and their history was a mess. But in the cold, logical heart of the galaxy, it was that very mess. The ability to find the crack in the foundation, the spite to hold a mirror to a god, and the sheer, stubborn will to follow a rule until it broke the person who made it, that made them superior. The Vohl would recover, eventually, but they would never look at a contract the same way again. And Earth? Earth was going home with the keys to the kingdom, bought with nothing more than a few thousand pages of sheer, glorious nonsense.